I want to talk a little bit about protectionism in this lecture. First, just sort of list the different ways that protectionism can take place. And then go through the one that's been in the news right now, a tariff, and how that operates. But let's look at the ways that they can, protect. So one way is that tariff, which is been sort of getting all the press right now, and that is a tax on imports. Okay. Now, in the 19th century, we actually sometimes taxed exports, particularly things like cotton, that we wanted to keep in the US so that it would have to be shipped up to the Northeast and go into the manufacturing plants, some of the textile plants up in New England. But usually these days, we're trying to keep out foreign goods, or at least make domestic goods competitive with foreign goods by imposing a tax on imports. The tax is paid when the product enters the U.S. So it's paid by U.S. firms and is passed along to U.S. consumers on that. But it does have impacts on foreigners. So that's a tariff. And then there's also subsidies. We don't often, sometimes these aren't categorized as protectionism, but they certainly are. They alter the prices between domestic and foreign firms, and they certainly have an impact. And China is very adept at giving subsidies of various sorts that are out there. A huge debate back in the Cancun session of the World Trade Organization was over sort of tariffs versus subsidies, that the focus had been on tariffs and removing those. But what a lot of developing countries felt is that the industrialized countries were imposing all sorts of subsidies, particularly on the agricultural sector. So they were forcing countries like Brazil and Malaysia to lower their tariffs, but then at the same time, they were imposing lots of subsidies on their industries. So this negotiations broke down, and in some ways, world trade stocks have never sort of taken over. That was back in 2003. So subsidies are another big issue, and then there's non-tariff barriers. So it's NTBs, or non-tariff barriers to trade, and these are things like quotas. A quota is a quantity restriction. Back in the 1980s, we had a restriction on the number of um, Japanese automobiles that could come in. So they often loaded them up so that they could sell for a higher price because they were restricted on quantity. But there were voluntary import quotas that were put in place. And then there are also regulations. And these are differential regulations between countries. There might be environmental regulations, there might be labor regulations, they might be health and safety regulations of various sorts. But I want to break these apart into something that the World Trade Organization will look at as product versus process standards. Okay. And product standards mean that there's a particular product that you want to keep out because it might be dangerous, or you might want to protect an industry of various sorts. So, Japan for a long while tried to keep out certain rice and stuff like that. Sorry. And then of various sorts, but there also can be process standards, which are about how the product is produced. So I know that in the negotiations over the North American Free Trade Agreement way back in the 1990s, not the current one, although I think they took place on that one as well, but way back in the 1990s, there was a lot of discussion about the US kept out certain forms of wheat from Canada, and Canada kept out certain forms of wheat from the US. Yeah, because of the different pesticides that they're using. So the U.S. didn't want the Canadian pesticides, and the Canadians didn't want the U.S. pesticides on that. That was a process standard, although you can see the dividing line becomes difficult because to the extent that those pesticides still stay in the product, is that a product standard or a process standard? There was a huge debate also in the 1990s over dolphin safe tuna and whether or not that was a product standard or a process standard. But in general, the World Trade Organization is open to product standards and far less open to process standards that are out there. But these are all different ways to protect them. And I want to put in one more that's relevant to today's trade war, and that is the currency. We'll do currencies later in the class, but I do want to talk a little bit about the Chinese currency, whether or not they're a currency manipulator, and what that means, and those sorts of things. I'll probably do that in the next segment on that. But I also want to get into right now just sort of looking at how a tariff operates, because that's the one that's been in the news most right now. So let's do it for heavyweight coats. And so on this axis will be the price of coats. And then on this axis will be the quantity of coats. Okay. And so if we're looking at this, let's suppose, let me put a domestic demand supply curve. So this is the supply domestically. And then this is the demand domestically. Okay. And the outcome of that, in the absence of trade, we'll say that the equilibrium price is 300 and the equilibrium quantity is 1,000. Okay. Now this would be the price domestically, and this would be the quantity domestic in the absence of trade. Okay. Now we'll assume that this is a good that is priced cheaper on world markets than in the US. And so we'll say that the world price of this, for now we'll just assume that the US is a relatively small country. It's not. It actually its buying behavior would affect this price. So this is a simplification on this. It changes things a little bit, but not that much. So let me just put in over here. Okay. And this is the world price, and I'll say that's $200. Okay. So now, let me get some colors here. If we go over to, so now we've opened up to trade, and so we now have to compete with this world price. If you're a U.S. Firm producing this coat, you have to compete with this world price. So we're going to, oops, excuse me. Sorry about that. Sorry. Sometimes this stuff just comes in my way. Okay, so we're going to follow the world price over to the supply curve, and that'll give us the quantity supplied domestically. So this is the domestic supply after we open up to trade, and we'll say that's 800. Okay, and then we're going to follow this across to the demand curve, and this will be the quantity demanded. That's the quantity supplied, and this is the quantity demanded domestically. And we'll say that's 1,400. Okay. So when we look at this, as soon as we open up to world trade, we're now, consumers can get this product cheaper. And so it's going to increase the quantity demanded from 1,000 to 1,400 domestically. At the same time, producers who wanted to produce when the price was up at 300 will no longer want to produce as much. And so domestically, the quantity supplied goes down from 1,000 to 800. Okay, so immediately we start seeing the effects of opening up to trade is that if it's an importable and there's a cheaper world price, consumers are going to benefit, but domestic producers are going to be hurt because of the lower price that's out there. So move along the demand curve and we move along the supply curve on this one. So now what we want to look at is suppose we're not happy with this and we want to help protect those domestic producers. Then what we'll do is we'll put a tariff on this. It could be a percentage tariff. I'm just going to say it's a per unit tariff on here, and let's just say it's a $50 tariff. Okay, so now we have the world price, okay, plus the tariff. And the tariff is $50, so this is now at $250. Okay, and the difference is a tariff of $50 per unit. Okay, so then what we do is we follow this across, and I guess I'll get a different color here. And we'll follow this across. And again, what you'll get is if you go to the supply curve, you'll get the quantity supplied at the new price. And so this now will be our quantity supplied, and we'll say that's 900. Okay, if we follow this across to the demand curve, we'll now get the new quantity demanded, and that we'll say is 1,200. Okay, so what's happened here is that we impose this tariff, the price that consumers face now is $250. Now, this is only on the goods that are coming in. So domestic producers now are not competing with a $200 price. They're actually competing with a $250 price. So they can actually jack up their prices, meaning that some of these producers will now want to produce more. So you get an increase in the quantity supplied. On the other hand, now consumers are facing a higher price because now they're going to face a $250 price. They're going to face that whether the good is imported or whether it's produced here, because if it's imported, they're going to face the tariff. And if it's produced here, domestic firms are going to raise their prices because now they don't have to compete with the lower price on that. Okay, so this graph is getting a little messy, but I'm going to continue on here once more. So before this, excuse me, before the imposition of the tariff, we were producing 800 and we were consuming 1,400. The difference between those two, the 600, that was imports. So if we look at this, if we are looking at this here versus this here, the distance between those was 600. Now, when we put the tariff in, we're producing more. We're going to produce another 100, but we're also going to see our consumption go down by 200. So now the amount that we are going to be importing is going to be between this and this. And so whereas before we were importing 600, now we're just going to be importing 300. So the distance here is 300. Okay. So in looking at this, let's think about what happened as a result of this tariff. And so as a result of this tariff, the domestic producers are made better off. So the producers of these winter coats, assuming there's any produced in the US, but the domestic producers in this industry are made better off. Okay. Secondly, consumers in the US are made worse off because they now pay a higher price and they're going to consume less of that. So we go from 1,400 that they're going to consume to 1,200 as a result of this. What else? We're also going to see higher prices in this industry domestically, and we're going to see fewer imports. So, one of the things we usually do this for is to reduce imports. Well, it should work on that because imports went from 600 down to 300. There's another beneficiary that's the government because they're charging the tariff. It's a tax, and they're charging it on 300 units of import. So it's basically the area of this curve here. And so this would be $50 times $300. I'm sorry, 50 times 300. Okay, that would give you the amount that they'd be generating. Okay, and so what else on this? Well, one, we'd also see that foreign producers would be made worse off. Okay, and we would also see that any firm, now this is a winter coat, it's kind of an end product on this. If this were steel or tires or anything like that, that's more of an intermediate good, those firms that use that product in their production would also see higher prices. And this becomes a real issue with tariff because particularly if you're doing it for lots of primary goods or intermediate goods, sometimes there's tariffs at each level of production. And so it might be a 10% tariff on steel, but then there might be another tariff on the automobile or on some other product that you're making on that, okay? And so at each level, you're increasing the cost to the firms that create those final products out there. So it gets pretty complicated to figure out just the overall effects of this. Sometimes if you have something, like titanium, if you put a tariff on titanium, it's used in mountain bikes, it's used in all sorts of other components, and you might see all those components go up in price as a result of the tariff. So it can be fairly significant on that. What else does this do? It also, generally speaking, and we'll learn this a little bit later in the course, putting tariffs in place on a large set of products will also tend to strengthen a country's currency. And this is interesting in the sense that it kind of works like something called Dutch disease. Dutch disease is when you have a oil boom, it tends to depress other industries because it tends to strengthen your currency and shift resources towards that fuel sector. But then because you have this stronger currency, then other sectors like manufacturing do worse. Well, often when you protect a large set of industries, your currency will strengthen, and then those industries that are not protected, they end up seeing themselves less competitive because there's a stronger currency out there. So it's a pretty complex thing. I did forget to mention one thing. Since most labor demand is derived demand, in other words, the demand for labor is derived from the demand for the product, that the tariff will usually help labor or in that industry, assuming they have the bargaining power to get some of it. But if there's a tariff on the steel that should help the owners of the steel industry, but it also should help the workers if they have the bargaining power to get some of that from that increased wages from the firms that are out there. So there's a large set of people that are affected by a tariff. Just to sort of go over it again, the key factors are consumers are going to pay higher costs. The producers in that industry will produce more and also at a higher price, so it improves profitability in that industry, generates revenue for the government. Also, other firms that use the product are going to face higher prices. Sometimes tariffs cause inflation if there are enough of them. We certainly haven't seen that yet in the U.S. economy, but some of the ones that are going in place in the next month or so are pretty significant. And Will that cause inflation? I don't know, but it has the possibility on that. Now, the other thing is that usually when you impose tariffs or any form of protectionism, there usually is retaliation. So other firms, when we've seen this with the soybean producers, soybean/corn producers, being affected by increased restrictions or quotas or other tariffs on the foreign goods coming in. Now, you would think that all of this, if you put tariffs in, that it would lead to a shift in production back to the U.S. if we do this, and sometimes it will. But sometimes, if we don't have a generalized tariff against all countries, what it might do is lead to a shift from one country to another. So what we've seen with the Chinese tariffs is that this has been very beneficial to Vietnam. So there's been a lot of production that is shifting from China to Vietnam. So it hasn't actually increased production in the US in a lot of industries. It's just shifted it from one country to the next that's out there. That's called trade diversion. Trade diversion, excuse me. Okay, so that's how a tariff operates. The key there is just to know the factors, what happens, and who's affected by it. So I'll stop there for now.